Hello, everyone. My name is Rob Sasweta. I'm with Mastery, now an Intel company. I chose not to wear the blazer today because I decided this is not the right place to do it, but typically I feel like I'm required to. At Mastery, I'm on the strategy services team. What our team does is we actually go out and we work with companies, primarily enterprises, and we help them develop their API program. We help them understand what the business value of their APIs are. We help them identify who their top partners are, who they should be going after, all that information. As part of that, we also offer API design. It's a fairly new thing. And I'm the one who actually started the API design part of that. Excuse me, I've got a bit of an allergy issue, so I'll be coughing throughout most of this. And so as part of that API design, I try to approach it from a strategy-first position. I want to understand what you want to accomplish, what is the business value behind your APIs, and then we design that API, that interface, based on that. So part of my job means I've got to go out there and understand what's happening in the RESTful space. I need to go get mixed up with the API craft folks. I need to go to the right conferences like Gluecon and RESTfest and APICon and all these other ones and talk to the smartest people in the room. And I got to tell you, the smartest people are in these rooms, always. And they're passionate. And they have great ideas. And they're full of good information. And it's wonderful. It's wonderful to have these people here and to hear that passion and get involved in those debates. But we have a problem. What I've noticed is I've worked with my customers and I've talked to people who are actually implementing these APIs. What I've noticed is they're getting mixed up in these debates. And for the most part, that's good. There's a lot of things that's not settled. There's a lot of talk about what is the right standard, where should we go. And for folks who are charged with talking about API design, writing books, writing blog posts, trying to figure out what the best case practices are, folks charged with moving this forward, it's great to have those passionate debates. But the folks who actually have to implement the APIs, they really just need to write the damn thing. And we're not helping them. And it's producing some really crappy APIs as a result. So for example, this is a very common thing I see. Is this a RESTful API? Well, yeah, I mean, it is, right? I mean, I can go here and I can provide whatever ID I want there and I will get the exact object back. But it's requiring me to go to the same endpoint, the same controller that I want to get the data I want. It's always going to be that query.php. I see this constantly. Strictly speaking, it's RESTful. And if you read all the books, well, you can kind of see how you can get away with it. You throw in some hypermedia with that, and all right, you're already at level 3. That works. God, what a crappy experience for developers. You can't cache this and rely on it because you don't know which part of that query string, unless you go through and parse it, is the ID. So I'm going to wind up as a client developer having to hard code this to make it work. Let's flip all the way to the other end of the spectrum. This is actually based on a real situation I've seen. So the goal here is to find Rob Sasweta in the employee database. So where do you start when you want to find somebody in the employee database? Well, naturally, you start in the country they're located in, right? So you go to the countries, then you go there, and it returns a whole bunch of URLs, and I can traverse that back down to the country I want. Oh, it comes back with states. I traverse to the state I want, all the way to California. Okay, California, I can see the divisions that are there, the employees that are there, I can see the facilities that are there, looking for employees. Okay, great. And then when I get to employees, I get the full list of all employees who happen to be in California. And from there, I can finally get the data, unless it leads me down to my address or whatever. I mean, strictly speaking, this is RESTful. I'm traversing, it's automated. I can discover where things are, I can update it pretty quickly. I can make sure that my customers are finding it. As a mental exercise, I encourage you to try to write code to this, just pseudocode, to see how many lines it takes you to traverse down to actually finding that employee record. It's about 3 or 4 times as long as just going straight to an employee's endpoint and getting that data. And yet I've seen this in the wild. And up, down, left, right, this is RESTful. It's the right way to do it. It's how we should be building it. Strictly speaking, yes. But if you're a client developer and you run into this, you're going to run in the other direction. So for giggles, I went and Googled what is a RESTful API, and one of the first things that came up, pretty much the top one, was a Stack Overflow. What is a REST API? And the answer is, a REST API is almost always just an HTTP API given a different, wrong name to make it sound better. This is the impression we're giving people in the RESTful space. Because REST, strictly speaking, is not an API standard. It's an architecture. It's an architecture that kind of tells you how you should be responding to requests. What are some of the facilities that are there? What are some of the affordances, to rely on the previous speaker, that are already there that my customers can use to access the data they need, to update that data, and to actually interact with my system. So in light of this, I've been working with a lot of customers and trying to settle them, trying to get them down into focusing on a good API and seeing what's out there. And for the last couple of years, as I've been doing this, as I've designed APIs for myself and for other companies, I've started to find kind of what these best practices are. And I've organized them to what I refer to as the NARWHL framework. It's an API design framework. It's an API design framework that is intended to build RESTful APIs intended for consumption by applications built by people. These are two very key pieces. It's intended for consumption by applications, which is to imply it's going to be machine readable. I want as much automation as I can reasonably get, but I can't assume that people are never going to be in the equation. You have to know that a developer is going to be looking at your URIs. They're going to be looking at your structures. They're going to be looking at the data you have, and they're going to be trying to troubleshoot something. So for those of you who have your laptops out, I actually put together a website. You can go ahead and look at it. All the details about what I'm going to talk about are on there. I encourage you, strongly encourage, almost beg you to please read through it and give me your comments and let me know. I'm going to let you follow along as I go. If you have any specific questions about what you've read, I'm going to hopefully have some time at the end for that. But that's the URL. I put it together last night. Please forgive me any errors that might be in there. The one thing that you shouldn't do when you build an API is have your customers come in confused. Don't surprise your customers with the design of your API. Surprise them with what it can do. Surprise them with the functionality of what they can accomplish using it. But don't surprise them with what it's going to look like and how it's going to feel. You want to build an API that they're going to be familiar with. You want to build an API that they're going to say, oh yeah, I know what I'm doing, and get them up and running so they can actually build things and deliver on time and not have to put in research spike after research spike just to figure out the hell you're trying to accomplish with your API. Don't make them go lost in the woods. So NARWHL, why did I call it NARWHL? Because when I describe, the first reason is because when I describe APIs, this is how I describe them. Nouns as resources with hyperlinks. It's pretty straight up normal, nothing to it. The key piece here is that what you're doing is you're extracting those nouns in your system, those objects in your system, and you're exposing them as the resources themselves. In that kind of crazy traversal one, you'll notice there were nouns. I guess a country is a noun, a state is a noun, but really those are parameters. Those shouldn't be resources. It's the core objects, the core nouns in your system that need to be the resources. So as I was describing this to some folks and saying, God, I don't know why this is so hard. They're just nouns as resources and add some hyperlinks. NARWHL. Second reason is because a NARWHL is the ultimate mashup. Check it out. It's a whale plus a unicorn. That equals a NARWHL, right? I work for Mastery. We dig mashups. Don't make me spell this out. That's a gimme, okay? But the third reason, and perhaps the most important reason, is this one. NARWHLs are real. I had a really interesting conversation with a coworker when I was trying to put this together. I was going to ask some of our design team to come out and help me develop or design an icon for this, and he came back and he said, it's going to be kind of hard to ask them to design something that doesn't really exist in the real world. I'm like, dude, no, they're real. They exist. You can go up and actually see them do this stuff. Why is this so important? Because your API, just like NARWHLs don't live in fantasy and they can't live in a fantasy world, your API can't live in a fantasy world. You have to get it out there. You have to build the thing. It has to be real. It can't be some mythical beast that you're hoping somewhere down the line somebody is going to maybe use, maybe not use. You've got to implement this stuff. You've got to build the tooling. You have to get those ideas out there. And NARWHL is all about creating APIs that people can use now. Legally, you're not allowed to talk about REST without either showing the Richardson maturity model or talking about Roy Fielding's thesis. It's a misdemeanor, so anybody, I saw some people doing that earlier, you will get tickets in the mail. So this is my obligatory Richardson maturity matrix or maturity model slide. NARWHL actually kind of starts where this leaves off. We want to get to level 3. This is what we've been talking about for RESTful design. We want to get hypermedia APIs out there. We want things to be linked in a way that is native to HTTP, that is native to the RESTful way of doing things. And so NARWHL was really built with this in mind. It was really designed with this in mind. So it kind of takes off where this leaves off. So the first piece is understanding how do I get to those nouns. And that's where you start relying on the use cases. You have to go through the active use case discovery. So when you're designing your system, you have to sit down and think about the actors and think about what the actors want to accomplish. And I want to make it very clear here. Do not leave this to your technical team. Don't leave this to your product team. Don't leave this to your biz dev team or your marketing team. Don't leave it to one team. This should be a cross-departmental, cross-disciplinary action. And I understand that the technical team actually really needs to get down to honest-to-God use cases that are like more standardized. That's fine. You can work with your teams to do that, but don't do it in a silo. And the reason is because your API is a product. It should be a product. Even if it's a product that you're only using internally, you want to make sure everybody in the company is aware of it. Because when they're aware of it, they will find opportunities to use it. So you want everybody involved. So when we start talking about use cases, this is kind of a theoretical e-commerce site, typical thing. A customer wants to browse for products by category. A customer wants to add a product to the shopping cart, the typical kind of things. Write these all out. Get as detailed as you can. Go as far as you can. Turn these into priorities. What is the most important thing? What is the MVP? What do I need to have as far as use cases to make this run? Now, as you start doing this, you'll start noticing that some of these nouns start appearing just magically. A customer wants to browse for products by category. So you start to see, okay, these are the kind of resources I'm talking about. I can extract those and have a pretty good idea that these are going to be the nouns that become the resources that are the core of my system. Very simple, very straightforward. It's a really good exercise to be a part of. Once you've got those resources, you can start designing your endpoints. Now, one of the more controversial things I've heard when I've talked to a lot of folks in the RESTful community is that endpoint design, your URIs, shouldn't matter. Shouldn't matter what you put out there because, especially in the hypermedia API, your clients are going to be traversing those URIs anyway. They shouldn't ever have to look at them. That is false. Yes, they're going to traverse them. Yes, on the whole, they probably shouldn't have to look at them. But if you've ever run into a situation where you've mistyped something, or you've gotten a weird error code back, or, I don't know, any number of different things, you know you're going to wind up looking at that URI. And if I look at that URI and it describes to me what's going on and what I'm trying to access, it's going to drop the time that it takes for me to troubleshoot that to a significantly lower amount. Don't make me struggle to figure out what your system is telling me to do. Help me. Help me by building into the URI. That's just for the client developer side. On the API provider side, you're going to have to be looking through your own logs as well. And you don't want to have to keep taking hash values and popping them back in the database just to figure out what the hell's going on. So let your URIs talk to you. That's a pretty standard format. You've seen this. It kind of came out as part of the whole MVC movement, particularly with Ruby on Rails and some of these other things. This is the kind of format I prefer. I want to see the ID embedded within the URI. I want the resource within the URI. The reason this matters is because if you do it this way, I can cache this. That resource shouldn't change. That ID should never change. So I can cache this and I should know it's always going to be there. And I can also have relationships built on this. So if I'm going to categories and I want to see what the different products are, in theory, I could go ahead and access that product directly through those categories, through that category link. When you do that, though, you should only have one link that is the canonical link for everything. So I showed you this one for products. This is the one link that you should have. This is another way to get to it. Typical RESTful API, that's okay, but you should only have one canonical link. And you should tell your customers, your client developers, what the canonical link is by using a header, link header. Fairly simple. This is standard. There's nothing new and surprising here. This is just best practices. put that in the header. That way, I, as a customer, if I want to go ahead and find out, okay, well, what am I supposed to be caching here? Can I cache this one? Oh, I'll look and see if there's a link header. Oh, there I see. There's a canonical header. I'll go ahead and cache that. It makes it easier for them. Another thing that I've tried to introduce is this idea behind content negotiation and making it sane. So hypermedia. We've talked about hypermedia controls. I gotta be honest with you, when folks first started talking to me about hypermedia controls, I know Mike's out here, and he was talking about ALPs about a year ago, and talking about profiles and hypermedia controls and stuff like that. I honestly had no idea what you were talking about. It took me so long to figure this out. And then one day I was sitting with one of our customers, and they brought up the idea of content negotiation and doing that for versioning, and it's like, a big bang went off in my head, and I completely understood, oh, that's what hypermedia is, that's what all this stuff is. Why the hell aren't we doing this? This is awesome! Because this eliminates so many problems. There's a couple reasons why. First off, if you're coming back with a MIME type of just plain old XML or plain old JSON or plain old whatever, you're doing it wrong, man. That gives me no information other than the basic high-level format of what's in it. Instead, give me more specific content types. Now, there's already profiles. There's like schema.org. There's all those things out there. You can use those today. They're available. You can take advantage of that. If you don't want to, if they don't quite fit your means, fine. Create your own media type. Create a custom media type. You don't even have to register it because it's only internal. I know I'm breaking all kind of rules by saying that. I don't care. But make sure you also include the version of what that media type is at the end. Your customers should know that they should be requesting a specific media type in their accepts header when they're making a request. I think I'm right about that. Yeah, when they're making that request, they should be specifying the media type they want. That way, they can stay on version 1 even after you've moved to version 2. You still need to signal to them, hey, we've up versioned. You might want to change this. But this is one way that you can do versioning at the endpoint, at that final endpoint resource level. Instead of having all these V1s and stuff embedded in URIs and all these different ways, do it in the header where it belongs. Do it at the content level where it belongs. This also allows you, like I said, to use other formats as they come out. Standards are settling. Better profile management systems are coming out. ALPS exists. Schema.org exists. All these things are coming out and settling. If you build it like this today, when those settle, or when you find one you prefer, or when everybody decides we're dropping everything and going with this thing, all you got to do is start providing that and change the content type. You don't have to break a bunch of stuff. You can still support the old content until everybody else catches up. The next part is talking about dynamic client generation. I think we can all agree, because I've heard this over and over again, SDKs suck. They suck because they're one more thing for you to maintain. They're not even your own code, but you have to maintain them so your customers can use them. So if you build an SDK that is custom to your API, you've got to maintain that. You've got to put it out there. You've got to make sure it's secure. You've got to make sure that it's not going to be resource intensive. You have to treat it like a separate product. That's fine if you've got the resources to do that. Who here has the resources dedicated just to SDKs? I don't see a single hand popping up. Oh, I see one. All right, one hand. All right, that's impressive. That's very impressive. You work for Microsoft? It's the only company I can think of off the top of my head. They also often assume functionality outside of the API. So there's going to be some functionality that people often want to build in the SDK because it makes it easier for the client developer, and put it in there. That's totally out of band. That means that you're creating functionality that really doesn't belong there at the SDK. It's something the client developer should build in. And they can get bloated really quick. They can get fat and ugly and terrible, and it's just, SDKs can get nasty. Now, for 3.5 years, I managed a public-facing SOAP API. I'm not allowed to talk about SOAP in this room, I realize. I'm not supposed to say good things about it. And it sucks, it does suck. It's got a tremendous amount of overhead. It's got a lot of issues with it. The one thing SOAP does well is it provides that WSDL. And every major language has a client that can read that WSDL and dynamically generate code to support it. And that's something that's missing in REST. You want to talk about wanting to get people up and running as quickly as possible. People are saying SDKs suck, we should ditch SDKs, we should make people go use their network libraries and access our stuff directly and parse our JSON directly. Have you guys used the Java network libraries? They suck. They're a pain in the butt. It's not like using Python or Rail or Ruby or what's the one I was using? Oh, JavaScript. I mean, those are natively connected languages. Java is not. And that's why you've got things like the Spring Framework and all these things built up around it, because they're trying to abstract that away, but even then you're going to run into errors, you're going to run into problems. So a better way to do this is to create code libraries that can be dynamically generated by defining your API using one of the more popular definition languages that are out there. And there's already a handful that are emerging, that are getting better. Of course, Mastery, I've got to mention IODocs is a big one, but there's also RAML, and there's Swagger. These are the big three. I'm sure there are more that I'm forgetting. Everybody seems to be wanting to put out an API definition language right now. I don't care what you support, as long as you provide one within your API, so that you can support dynamic client libraries. They reflect only what's defined in the API, because you're defining that in the definitions file. That definitions file can be reused for documentation, all kinds of other stuff. They'll grow and they'll change as the API changes. So if your API changes, fine, you do that. The dynamic library just reads the definitions file, it updates accordingly. And really, the big deal, they feel more native to the developer. The last speaker asked how many people do object-oriented programming. How many of us do functional programming? If I create libraries in the major languages that dynamically generate code for these APIs, I don't have to worry about the structure of the API as a client developer. I don't want to have to think about the structure of your API, how to get the base URL, how to add parameters, how to parse your JSON, how to parse your XML. Let the code do it for me. Give me a library so it appears just like another object in my system. That's going to help. Going one step further, though, I have this vision. I'm going to share it with you today. It's coming from on high. I have a vision where my 70-year-old father, he turns 69 tomorrow, my 69-year-old father, who only just got his first computer, who can barely use the phone in his pocket, can program his own interactivity. This already exists in things like if this then that, right? But in order to take advantage of if this then that, I have to have some kind of connector built so that if this then that knows what's to surface, so that I can know what I can control, blah, blah, blah. With the definition language, I can build dynamic pages that know what's available through the API and can surface that, so that I can provide visual programming, so I can provide simpler programming. When we start moving on to the Internet of Things, I really believe this is going to be what sends it over the top, is this ability for anybody, whether you're a programmer or not, to design your own interactions between your connected devices. And this is what's going to help get us there. So last but not least, I understand that a lot of the stuff I'm talking about here, and again, I encourage you to go to the site, and I'll give you the URL again in a minute. A lot of this stuff is pretty pie in the sky. I'm not telling you this is easy. It's intended to get you started so that our API developers, the folks who just need to build something, I just need to build something, I don't give a crap about your crazy religious wars. I just need to build an API that people can use that's going to be as close to RESTful, as close to perfect as I can get, as close to best practices as I can get. That's what NARWHL is intended to do. It's a framework to help people just get rolling and allow them to grow as these standards start to settle. So I have my own maturity model. Sorry, Leonard. It starts off at level 0. If all you do is present your nouns as resources and add hyperlinks, you're already pretty much there. You're pretty solid. That's good. That's good. If you implement JSON responses in that NARWHL style format, which is defined on the website, that's even better. Whether you use NARWHL JSON or HAL or Siren or whatever else is coming down the pipeline, doesn't matter. You still want to have those straight up JSON simple responses where the response for the single request is actually at the top level and the related links are also embedded within that. Going on a step higher, you add the content negotiation piece. That's a big deal. That's going to free you up tremendously. It's going to help you with versioning. It's going to help you with maintenance. It's going to help you iterate faster as your API grows, as you need to change things. It will give you the leg up to keep moving forward. And at the very top is response profiles and definitions. That's the thing where you're doing dynamic client generation. If you can add that and start supporting that, not only will you be able to help your developers, you'll be able to help yourselves. Instead of maintaining these out of source, out of band data dictionaries, trying to define what a product is and what's the difference between a SKU number and a SKU pound and a SKU NO, and trying to figure out all this crap. You define it one time. That is your content. That lives in your system. All your developers rely on that. Now, the reason I've got this up here is because, like I said, you can start at the bottom and move up. If you don't have enough time to build out the whole response profiles and definitions, which really isn't all that well settled anyway, and not too many people are going to take advantage of it, fine, do it later. As long as you go from bottom to top, you'll be able to iterate over this and build the glory, the awesomeness of a NARWHL framework. So once again, I'm going to throw the URL up here. I got 5 minutes left for questions. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. More importantly, I really, really want to encourage you, don't make me beg. Please go to the site. Please take a look. Please comment. Give me feedback. Tell me I'm full of it. Tell me it's awesome. Tell me where I broke shit. Just help me. Because this is the kind of thing where I want this to move forward. I want to help developers build awesome APIs. And I want to continue these discussions about what is best for REST and what is good and how we should do this. But I don't want the folks who actually have to implement this who are on a deadline. I don't want those guys to get caught up in this. That's what we're here for. So thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Questions? There's a question. Hold on.
Love it.
So it sounded to me like your top, the sort of the highest level of what is sort of like dynamically generated SDKs. So sort of, you don't have to have somebody maintaining them, but in effect you're still delivering SDKs that are maybe easier to keep versioned. They're simpler and so forth. Would you agree with that, or is that sort of off base?
I consider it to be slightly off base, and the only reason being is because what I'm talking about is dynamically created client libraries. Yeah, those have to be maintained. They don't necessarily have to be maintained by you. And that's the joy behind this. The more people who start doing this, the more people who start taking advantage of API definitions, the more people who will be needing and using these kinds of client libraries are going to read these definitions and dynamically create the data. An SDK is a software development kit that is really focused on just one thing and one thing alone. It's kind of like, I don't know if you guys watch Alton Brown. I love Alton Brown. He talks about not wanting to have single-use tools in the kitchen. He wants to have tools that will be multi-use. A client library that takes something like a WSDL or a WADL or an API definition and turns that into usable code, whether that definition comes from your API or your API or your API, or it doesn't matter, that's a multi-use tool. That's a client library. So yes, strictly speaking, it's still something that's similar to an SDK in the sense that I'm helping customers, I'm helping clients develop faster. But I mean, it's not a good thing. I want to help clients develop faster. But more importantly, it's not stuck on just one API. It's multifunctional. Follow-up question.
So to hearken back to a previous speaker, what you're really saying is if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck.
Exactly. Dances like a duck. Exactly.
Other questions?
We need to start building more ducks, especially with the wormholes in the middle. That was awesome.
I'm stalling for the drawing, so I need a question. Somebody think up a question.
Question.
Oh,
Who's
way
got
back
a
there.
question? Oh, hey, all right.
How would you respond to the criticism from yesterday that dynamically creating SDKs just lets you create a lot of crappy APIs? SDKs.
I disagree with that completely. Because first of all, what you're saying, it depends on how we're talking about this. So SOAP client libraries, one thing that I've never been a fan of is the way that, for example, .NET and Java, oh God, I can't remember off the top of my head, Ajax, I can't remember what it is. The way that .NET creates client libraries right now through SOAP is it actually creates a whole bunch of stub code that you have to compile in. The way that Rails and Perl and some of these other ones do it is they actually dynamically create that within the code itself. So it happens immediately. As long as those libraries are clean, as long as they're fairly well developed, I know there's a lot of ifs, but as long as those libraries are built so they're efficient, I don't really see a problem with that. I don't think you're going to have a lot of bloat and a lot of crappy APIs, and I don't think that you're creating crappy APIs or crappy SDKs. I think a crappy API just kind of comes naturally if you don't know what you're doing. The SDKs are intended to help, and I think even more importantly, just beyond, like I said, beyond talking about dynamic client generation and dynamic code generation, the two other areas where I think this is really important is, like I mentioned, the idea of having dynamic systems that will read this data and present the ability to do interaction even for folks who are not programmers. So that discoverability is really key for that, and I really do think that's the future, and that's where we need to get to. The second one is, how do you guys do your test-driven development, or how do you do your testing against your API interfaces now? I mean, is anybody here, who here is actually testing against the direct interface, the interface that their customers see as part of the continuous testing and integration tests? That's an impressive number, actually. That impresses me, because I've not seen too many people doing that. And I think that providing that discoverability, by defining that in these definition files, what you're basically doing is setting up the tests. It's almost like TDD. You're doing some level of test-driven development, and then my test clients can use that to confirm that, yeah, no, it matches. And then I can reuse those definitions for things like interactive documentation, all the other kind of stuff that's out there. So I really think that dynamic client generation is an important piece. It's something that we really should be thinking about, at least providing those API definitions in band with the rest of the APIs, so we can get to this glory of dynamic clients, discoverable clients for multiple uses, and easier development against tests. Make sense? That makes sense.
Any other questions? We got time for one more. Okay.
Yeah, so I was just curious, how nested would you make your REST resources? I know there's been a lot of discussion about that.
That's a really good question. I tend to think that if you're over nesting your resources, that there's probably something wrong with your design. I wouldn't go beyond 3. Categories / ID / products / ID / manufacturer, maybe that. That's as deep as I would go. But even then, your canonical URL should be /products / ID / manufacturer to find out the manufacturer of that product. And then if I want more details about that specific manufacturer, again, it's just /manufacturer / ID. So if you're going deeper than that and you've got these crazy long URLs that are super crazy nested, revisit the way you've set up your resources, because you're probably not normalizing them in a way that makes more sense. So normalization of resources is kind of a big deal. It's very similar to normalizing your tables and normalizing your data for when you're setting up a database. One of the things that, like I showed earlier, where you've got that huge traversal, that's way over normalized. Way over normalized. Under normalized is one where I go to /categories and all the product data, all the manufacturer data, all the shipping data, all of that's in one response. That's another thing I see, is just these ginormous responses that can very easily be normalized by pulling out the different objects, the different resources they represent. But I'd say going beyond 3 is probably overkill.
All right. Rob Z, thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.